This is Claude. He's from Burundi and is currently a refugee living in a camp in western Tanzania for the past 2 years. But he first sought refuge in 1972 to Congo as an infant on his mother's back after his father was killed. 20 years later, refugees were being called to return and told that Burundi was peaceful. So voluntary return is actually the most favored solution for refugees by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. It affects the largest number of refugees globally. Claude's mother, like many others, returned, but Claude stayed behind to finish school. Within a year, Claude learned that his mother had been killed in renewed violence, and just a few years later, violence in eastern Congo forced Claude to flee again. He crossed the lake to Tanzania and was put in a refugee camp, where he worked as a teacher, met his wife, and had his first children. When Burundi was considered peaceful again, the camps were closed, and they had no choice but to return to Burundi. There he had no home to go back to, no land to farm, and felt discriminated against in finding work because he had been a refugee. Often, research and policies on return tend to assume that it's a one-way and one-time migration, but more recent studies show that returnees often need to continue to migrate. They argue that the idea of permanent return as the ideal solution for refugees fails to take into consideration actual patterns of movement. For example, many others who returned with Claude tried to return to Tanzania or to Congo to find land and jobs. Claude stayed, but within a few years, renewed political and violence pushed his family to flee again, back to camps in Tanzania. We don't yet know much about migration trajectories of returnees, or about repeated forced migration after return, and what this means for refugee protection and for solutions. Like Claude, around 80% of current Burundian refugees in Tanzania have previously been refugees at least once before. Many of them have experienced multiple prior forced migrations. Past returns to Burundi were meant to be a solution to their situation, but didn't last. Now, both the Burundian and Tanzanian governments have stated that Burundi is peaceful again, and they're calling for refugees to return again. Many international organizations are wary. And what do refugees think after their prior experiences of return? I want to learn how both governments and humanitarian institutions understand return in relation to issues like peace building in this context, and what that means for refugee protection and solutions. But I also want to learn how their perspectives compare with those of refugees, whose experiences and perspectives are shaped by their prior experience of refuge and return, and refuge and return again.